When he finally reaches out, there's a part of you that lights up. Whether it's been days, weeks, or even longer, that notification lights up your phone and suddenly everything you told yourself about moving on feels like it's under attack. You want to respond. You want to feel connected again. You want to know why he's reaching out and what it might mean. But here's the trap. Most people in that emotionally charged moment respond immediately, almost instinctively. Not because they've thought about it carefully, but because the message gave them a jolt of hope, curiosity, or even validation. That quick reply, that impulse to respond right away, that's not about interest. It's about anxiety. What happens when you respond immediately is that you unknowingly shift the dynamic. Whether you mean to or not, you send a silent message. I've been waiting. I'm available. I'm still here. And maybe that's not even true. Maybe you've been working on yourself, setting boundaries, healing. But the second you fire back without pause, all of that inner work can get overshadowed by the signal you just sent. You may not have said, yes, come back in, but to someone who knows your patterns, an immediate response is enough to think they still have access to you. And here's where things get messy. People notice patterns more than they notice promises. You can say all day long, this time I'm doing things differently. But if the second he calls, you're picking up before the second ring, he learns that nothing has really changed. There's also the energy dynamic at play. In any connection, timing creates perception. People respond differently when they feel like they have to work for something. If someone reaches out and feels like they can have your attention on demand, their effort decreases. It's not always malicious, it's psychological. Humans value what they perceive as scarce. So if your attention is always available, it doesn't matter how special or valuable you are as a person. Your availability will begin to shape their behavior, often unconsciously. That's when someone starts getting lazy in communication. They know they don't have to do much to get a reaction from you, so they stop trying. They stop planning. They stop pursuing. But when you pause before replying, not to play games, but to check in with yourself, you reclaim your power. That space between receiving the message and replying gives you clarity. It allows your brain to come online, not just your heart. Because when you don't pause, when you rush to reply, it's usually not about the other person. It's about the feeling you're chasing. That little high you get from reconnecting, even if the connection is shallow. That tiny relief from loneliness. That hit of, maybe this time it'll be different. And that's how people get trapped in cycles, repeating the same emotional loop, thinking they're building something when in reality they're just soothing a wound. By choosing not to respond immediately, you're not being manipulative. You're being mindful. You're honoring the progress you've made. You're giving yourself the dignity of reflection. You're asking yourself, what do I want this to mean? Instead of letting the moment define your response. And sometimes, in that pause, you realize you don't want to reopen this door. Or maybe you do, but not on autopilot, not from a place of emotional neediness, but from a place of calm strength. Because when you wait, you get to see how the other person follows up. Do they just want a momentary fix of attention, or do they actually make an effort? When you wait, you force clarity. You shift from being the reactive one to the responsive one. You put yourself in a position to observe, not just react, and more importantly, you give yourself the chance to be intentional. So, the next time he reaches out, whether it's a simple hey or something deeper, resist the urge to prove your availability. You're not on call, your time is valuable, your attention is earned. And more than anything, your self-respect should never be traded for a fleeting moment of connection. When someone who's been absent suddenly contacts you, it's easy to let hope override history. You might tell yourself that maybe this time it means something more. Maybe he's realized what he lost. Maybe he's grown. But that maybe can be a dangerous place to live in, especially if your heart is still carrying wounds from what happened before. One of the biggest mistakes people make when he reaches out again is reopening their heart too quickly without requiring any sign of growth, responsibility, or change. A text, a call, or a casual "I miss you" can feel like a breakthrough when you've been sitting in silence. But it's important to remember that contact is not the same as effort. Interest is not the same as commitment. Regret is not the same as accountability. It's incredibly tempting to take his message as a green light to jump back into the same emotional rhythm you were once in. The familiarity can feel like comfort. The attention can feel like healing. But what you're feeling might not be about him at all. It might be about the version of the story you've told yourself while you waited for closure. If you reopen your heart based on emotion alone, without any evidence that trust can be rebuilt, you risk walking back into something that broke you before. And often, people who come back don't come back because they've changed. They come back because they're lonely, bored, or curious. That's not the same thing as readiness. That's not the same thing as someone realizing your worth. And if you give your emotional energy away too soon, you'll end up doing all the work to make the reconnection feel meaningful, while he simply benefits from the door being wide open again. The key is understanding that emotional connection doesn't equal emotional safety. You can still feel drawn to someone who wasn't good for you. You can still miss someone who hurt you. That feeling isn't proof that they belong in your life again. It's a signal to check in with your heart, not to hand it over. Because trust isn't something you give away because someone says the right thing. It's something that's earned slowly through consistency, honesty, and behavior that aligns with their words. If someone truly wants to rebuild what was broken, they'll show you through actions that are different from before. They won't pressure you for instant access. They won't act entitled to your affection just because they've come back. They'll understand that rebuilding trust takes time, and they'll be willing to show up for that process without rushing it. But here's what often happens. The moment you hear from him, you remember the best parts of the connection. Your mind replays the highlights. You remember the laughter, the late night talks, the way it felt when it was good. And in doing so, you can easily forget why it ended. You can minimize the distance, the emotional unavailability, the hurt, the confusion. You can romanticize the history, edit out the pain, and convince yourself that maybe it wasn't so bad after all. That's why it's dangerous to let a message override your memory, because if you ignore the full picture of what happened before, you're setting yourself up to repeat the same cycle. You're giving someone access to your most vulnerable parts without requiring them to earn it, and that's not strength. That's self-betrayal dressed as forgiveness. Rebuilding trust is not just about giving someone another chance. It's about giving yourself the protection you didn't have the first time. It's about setting a higher standard, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. Because if someone truly values you, they won't just reach out, they'll reach in. They'll ask questions about your needs, not just talk about their feelings. They'll acknowledge the past without defensiveness. They'll take steps to make you feel secure, not just wanted. And if you don't see those things, you have to be willing to keep your heart guarded, no matter how much you want to believe that this time is different. Reopening your heart should never be automatic. It should be intentional, slow, and based on what you're seeing, not just what you're feeling. It should be guided by your boundaries, not your loneliness. It should be rooted in evidence, not in nostalgia, because a message can stir your emotions, but only time and consistency can restore your trust. When he finally reaches out after days or weeks of silence, there's a wave of emotion that hits you. It's that mix of relief, anticipation, curiosity, and sometimes even validation. The problem is, in that emotional moment, many people mistake any form of contact for genuine effort. A simple "hey" text, a late night "I miss you," or a random "wide" can feel like progress, but these are not signs of someone truly showing up. They're often lazy forms of communication that require zero investment, zero planning, and zero vulnerability. Responding to this kind of low-effort message can trap you in a dynamic where you're always hoping it turns into something meaningful while he's doing the bare minimum just to stay on your radar. There's a huge difference between someone reaching out because they genuinely care and someone reaching out just because they're used to the comfort of your attention. That comfort contact often comes at a time when they're bored, lonely, or just looking for some quick emotional reassurance. And it can be confusing because the message might seem harmless on the surface. But it's not about what's said. It's about what it costs you emotionally when you allow low-effort communication to re-enter your space. That kind of interaction doesn't nourish you. It drains you. It stirs up old hopes without offering anything real or reliable in return. When someone sends a lazy message and you respond with energy, depth, or enthusiasm, you're creating a one-sided conversation. You're giving high-value engagement in response to low-value effort, and that imbalance sets the tone for how the rest of the interaction will go. People often rise or fall to the level of effort they believe is required to keep your attention. If he learns that a casual, "Hey," gets a warm, emotionally available response from you, why would he ever feel the need to put in more thought, more time, or more intention? Without realizing it, you're reinforcing a pattern where he doesn't have to grow, change, or lead the way back to something meaningful. He just has to drop breadcrumbs and you'll do the rest. It's also important to realize that lazy communication is often a form of emotional control. It keeps you thinking about him. It pulls you back into his orbit just enough to prevent you from fully detaching or moving on, but never enough to create the kind of connection that brings safety or clarity. It's like emotional limbo. You're constantly on edge, wondering if this message means he's ready or serious or finally understands. But that uncertainty isn't romantic. It's exhausting. It robs you of peace. It makes you question yourself, overanalyze everything he says, and justify behaviors that deep down you know don't align with your worth. There's also a deeper emotional layer that comes into play here. If you grew up learning to settle for breadcrumbs, if your emotional needs were minimized or met inconsistently, you may have been conditioned to find these small moments of attention exciting. You might even mistake them for intimacy, but real intimacy doesn't start with vague, surface-level messages. It starts with presence, with effort, with actions that show someone is truly thinking about you, not just thinking about themselves and their own emotional itch they want to scratch. The temptation to respond to lazy messages is real, especially if you miss him or you've been feeling lonely. But just because someone reaches out doesn't mean they deserve your energy. Just because he says, "I've been thinking about you," doesn't mean he's willing to invest in you. Look at the patterns. Is he reaching out to actually build something or just to remind you he still has access to you? Does he follow up with clarity and consistency, or does he disappear again after getting a quick hit of validation from your response? When you stop accepting lazy communication, you raise the bar for what kind of connection you allow into your life. You send a clear message, not just to him, but to yourself, that your heart is not available for half measures, that you're not someone who gets excited just because someone remembered you exist. You're someone who knows the difference between being wanted and being valued. And unless someone is showing up with the kind of energy that reflects intentionality, presence, and emotional maturity, they don't get access to the part of you that shows up with depth, love, and consistency. When someone who once left your life reaches out again, it's incredibly easy to forget the parts of the relationship that hurt. The human mind is wired to cling to what's familiar, especially when it involves strong emotional attachment. In those moments of reconnection, your memory has a strange way of selectively recalling the warmth, the laughter, the feeling of being close, while quietly muting the nights you cried, the anxiety of waiting for a reply, the confusion, and the times you felt like you were not enough. You might catch yourself rereading the message over and over, searching for meaning, holding on to the idea that maybe this is the moment things turn around. But here's the reality. The past you're tempted to romanticize is the same past that once made you feel uncertain, undervalued, or even broken. People often assume that time alone changes everything, that a few weeks or months apart automatically means someone has grown, healed, and now understands your value. But growth isn't passive, it's intentional. It requires someone to take accountability, reflect on their behavior, and do the work to be different going forward. Just because time has passed doesn't mean maturity has happened. If you don't remind yourself why things fell apart, you risk reopening a door that was closed for very real, painful reasons. Those reasons might have included neglect, emotional inconsistency, poor communication, or a complete lack of effort. If those issues were never acknowledged, discussed, or repaired, why would you expect anything to be different now? The heart can be impulsive. It wants comfort, resolution, and hope. So when he reaches out, your heart may want to believe it's a sign. that the chapter you thought ended is about to restart with a happier twist. But that feeling doesn't necessarily reflect truth, it reflects your emotional longing. And longing can be dangerous when it clouds your memory of what actually happened. If you don't stay grounded in reality, you may respond in a way that says, it's okay to skip the hard part. It's okay to bypass the healing, the apology, the ownership. And when that happens, you're not just forgiving, you're forgetting. You're forgetting how small you felt in the moments when he withdrew. You're forgetting the words that confused you, the promises that never turned into action, the pattern of being close and then cold again. To move forward in a healthy way, you have to keep your memory intact. That doesn't mean holding a grudge or living in bitterness. It means having the courage to face the full truth of the relationship, not just the beautiful moments that make you miss it, but the painful patterns that made you walk away. It means not minimizing what hurt just because someone reached out with a smile or a sweet message. You can acknowledge the good, but you must also respect the lessons you learned, because if those lessons came through heartbreak, they were earned, and they should not be discarded just to chase the illusion of a different ending. It's not easy to sit with that discomfort. Your mind might argue that people deserve second chances, that maybe this time he really means it. And sometimes people do grow. Sometimes reaching out is the first step toward real change. But you won't be able to tell if that's true if you rush past your own clarity, if you silence your own intuition just because the sound of his voice still makes your chest flutter. That reaction is normal, but it's not always wise. The part of you that gets excited when he reaches out isn't weak. It's human. But the part of you that remembers the truth, that's strength. And that part deserves your attention. You may also find that the more distance you've had, the clearer things have become. And when he contacts you again, the temptation is to see that message as proof that the story still matters. But a message without action is just noise. A message without growth behind it is just nostalgia. If you don't use your memory as a guide, you may find yourself explaining your boundaries all over again, defending your needs, and slowly sliding back into a version of yourself you worked hard to grow beyond. And that version may be too forgiving, too hopeful, too quick to ignore what your gut is quietly whispering the moment you read his name on your screen. When he reaches out after a period of silence or distance, it can create a wave of emotional urgency inside you. That message can feel like a window opening just when you were about to close the door completely. And in that vulnerable moment, one of the most common mistakes people make is trying to impress him all over again. You start overperforming. You want to show him what he's been missing. You try to be extra charming, funny, agreeable, attractive, or understanding, not because it's how you naturally feel in that moment, but because you subconsciously want to win him back or remind him of what he lost. That need to perform doesn't come from confidence, it comes from fear. The fear that if you don't present yourself in the most appealing way possible, he won't stay. When you shift into that performative mindset, you disconnect from your authenticity. You stop speaking from your truth, and instead you start curating your responses to avoid tension, to create attraction, or to make things smooth. But what you sacrifice in that process is honesty. You begin to walk on emotional eggshells. You don't ask the questions that really matter because you're afraid of scaring him off. You hesitate to express your hurt or your standards because you're worried he might disappear again. And this fear is not unfounded. It's rooted in past experiences. You remember what it felt like when he pulled away, when he stopped responding, when he left without explanation. That memory fuels the quiet panic to keep things light, to not come across as too much, too intense, too needy. So you start adjusting who you are in order to maintain his interest. But interest maintained by performance is fragile. It's not sustainable because eventually your real self shows up. And if the connection wasn't built on truth from the start, it won't withstand the weight of reality. More importantly, when you try too hard to be chosen, you forget to choose for yourself. You forget to ask if he's even showing up in a way that deserves your time, your softness, your energy. You focus so much on making a good impression that you ignore the opportunity to evaluate him, to assess if his presence now actually meets the emotional standard you've set for your life. And that's where many people lose their power, not in giving someone another chance, but in giving up their voice the moment that chance appears. There's a version of you that exists when you're confident, grounded, and self-respecting. That version doesn't chase. It doesn't try to convince anyone of its value. It doesn't speak from fear. It holds space for honesty, even when that honesty might lead to discomfort or conflict. That version of you understands that connection should feel mutual, not earned through performance. And when you operate from that place, you're no longer impressed by someone simply reaching out. You know that a message is not a measure of effort. You know that a comeback doesn't erase the way someone left. You know that if someone wants real access to your heart again, it requires more than charm. It requires character. Trying to impress someone who left you in confusion or silence puts you in a submissive, emotional position. It places your self-worth in their hands again. And it says, even if silently, that their opinion of you matters more than your own peace. But someone who is truly worthy of you will not need to be dazzled or convinced. They'll show up willing to meet you as you are, not as the version of yourself you think they want. They will ask how you've been, not just to make conversation, but to understand what you've gone through. They will listen, not just to reply, but to understand. And they will take responsibility, not just to appease you, but because they've genuinely reflected and grown. There's a quiet power in not needing to perform when someone comes back. There's freedom in knowing that the person you are right now is enough, not the polished, perfect version, but the real you, the one who's done the healing, the one who's learned from pain, the one who now sees love, not as something to chase, but as something to be shared between two people who show up fully without pretense. And when you stay connected to that version of yourself, you won't lose yourself in the process of reconnecting. You'll remain rooted in your truth, even if the outcome is uncertain, because true connection can only happen when both people are showing up honestly. And if you're the only one doing that, then it's not a connection. It's a performance.